This fly is called a CDC and Elk. It comes from Hans Weilenmann, who lives in the Netherlands. And it's sort of an unconventional caddis pattern. And it can cross over for a lot of different bugs. Really a nice, cripply, low-floating pattern that's really simple to tie. The materials we'll use is a Tiemco 100 or 100 SP dry fly hook, a natural gray CDC feather, some natural colored deer hawk or fine-tipped deer hair, and for thread I'm going to use 50 denier GSP thread in brown. The reason I'll use the GSP thread is to bind down a relatively heavy clump of this deer hair at the front of the fly. If you've got a softer clump of deer hair, you can do it just fine with 8/0 thread as well. So to start this fly, I'm going to start the thread just a couple eye lengths back from the hook eye. And I'm going to build this thread base all the way back to the bend. And once I'm there, I'm going to leave the thread hanging. Now I've dug through this bag of CDC, and what I was looking for is a feather that's got a relatively thin stem. I like the square tip, and some of these long straggly fibers at the base. You have to be kind of careful up here at the butt end of the feather that you don't have too thick a stem, and they usually have a little nub that I'm going to peel off, so I've got something to grab onto with my hackle pliers here in a minute. So I'm going to take this feather and I'm going to stroke some of these fibers down about half and half. So I'm going to use 1/2 to tie down to the shank, and the rest of this is going to end up being wrapped around the hook sort of like a hackle, a long scraggly hackle at the front of the hook. So I'm going to tie this in right at that division point. Then I'll wrap forward over the tips of those feathers, of that feather. And now I'll grab the feather in my hackle pliers. I'm going to grab the stub end here, and I'm going to make the first couple turns coming up the hook. You can see where those fibers have been bound down. They sort of look like dubbing. It's making a nice buoyant body, really quick and simply. And as I get up into the loose fibers at the front, they're going to start to stand out. I'm going to comb these back just little by little as I come around the hook. And you can see how those will kind of straggle out. And I'll tie that off just behind our starting point there at the front of the fly. So you can see this fly is already a little unconventional in that it's not a terribly clean looking pattern. There's fibers sticking out all over. The way this fly is fished is these CDC fibers are not made to float the fly, but instead they'll get wet and move around in the surface film. The fly will sit up on the surface, but that's more because of the deer hair than it is the CDC. The CDC is just going to create a little bit of movement on this fly and make those scraggled ends kind of create some life. If you've got anything that's extra long, you can go in and just snap it off with your fingertips. Anything that's sticking forward, just slide back and put a couple turns over. You can see how that just kind of smooths things back along the hook. And I'm going to I like to tie this fly with a little heavier wing. Some tyers tie it really sparsely, and that does work as well. But I figure if I tie a heavier wing, I can always thin that wing down on the water a little bit. Where if I tie a sparse wing, I can't make it get any thicker. So I'm going to cut a relatively large clump of deer hawk here, and I'm going to clean it out, make sure I get all the underfur out of that hair, just by sweeping my finger back and forth to get all the underfur and short hairs out of that clump. Then I'll put this hair in my small stacker and wrap it a few times on the tabletop to square those tips up. You can see how that evens the tips of those hairs up like a paintbrush. It's going to make this hair a lot easier to work with because we're working with all the same length. And it's going to make the fly look a lot cleaner as well. So now I'm going to take this stacked clump of hair and I'm going to measure it about a shank length long. Now one of the tricks on this fly is to get this hair cut and measured to length before we attach it to the hook. So I'm measuring using my thumbnail here on the back side of the fly to 1 shank length long. I've lined my thumbnail up right with where that hair intersects with 1 shank length long. So now I could grab that clump of hair and just butt my fingers together and trim the butt ends off at that point. Now I'm going to lay this hair on top of the hook with those buttons just behind the hook eye. And I'm going to take 2 turns over this hair. I'm going to draw the thread toward me to tighten that. And that'll close that wrap of thread down that cinches that hair down. You can see how it flared out into a little semicircle there. I'm going to work the thread through those buttons, just 2 or 3 turns right up to the hook eye. Nice tight turns to anchor that hair down. And I'll whip finish just behind the eye. Come in and trim my thread out. And that's our CDC and Elk. You can change the colors on it. I've used natural tan colored CDC and different colors of deer hair on the top. But really this just basic general version here seems to do the trick most of the time. I tie it in about sizes 14 through 20s.